Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Now, I've been getting back into Zwift racing the past couple of weeks, and I've been enjoying the Zwift Unlocked amongst other events. But it was time for me to get back into racing and bring back the live streams, which are very popular on this channel, I must admit. Now, I thought it'd be good to do a little summary video maybe each week where I look back on those races and pick apart some of the disgusting efforts that they've brought out of me, quite frankly. So let's kick things off with, surprise, surprise, the Zwift Racing League. Now, I haven't raced at this level since, well, last winter. And because I haven't done any of the British hill climb season this year outdoors, I was severely lacking any kind of top end. In fact, the last time I've done any kind of big, deep, hard efforts like we did in this race was probably back in July and August. But my excuses out of the way, we rolled up on the start line. Now, the course this week was a tough one. It was a real tough one, with 4 climbs on the Everything Bagel course in New York. The actual course itself is probably not that difficult other than those climbs in question. And let me tell you, I was glad to have done a warm-up before this one. As the case with most of these events, especially in the A category, the race doesn't really start off with any kind of impetus. If anything, it's just waiting for the carnage to unfold on the first climb, which it does. And I find myself getting towards the back of a very strung out group. A dangerous place to be. But there wasn't really much I could do. I was pretty much gasping. I'd never touched this kind of effort and power for a good few weeks, well, / months. So this was danger territory. So after the first climb, I found myself in the second group on the road. Not so bad. And we eventually got back on. We only really got back on because that front group of about 15 or 20 was just waiting again for the next KOM. Now, I actually did a little bit better on the second climb, probably because it suits me a little bit more, although I did still get dropped towards the top, where I really struggled just to make that final big effort, that last 30-second sprint, if you will, to get over the top with the people who are really up there scoring points. So I was put on the back foot, and on the descent, lost the group. Now, at this point, I waited for the group behind. It was the best thing to do in this situation. Now, once we regrouped, we realised we had a pecking order. And I was within this second group on the road, the second peloton, and we were pretty happy now to be in the group we were in and just wait until that next climb. We were never going to get back across to that front group. The gap now was really extending. The third time up the climb, being in the group I was in, I fared okay. Again, people were still trying to score points at the top of the KOM, so that bit stung a bit, but we didn't really string out. The group didn't really split up. Now, I did feel like it was at this point, with just one climb left, that, well, people were maybe starting to fade. I was starting to fade too, but I definitely felt like there was a good chance of me maybe trying to get away. And I would score points on the climb if I had a bit of an advantage going into it. And this is what happened. Me and one other rider managed to just chip off and settle into a good rhythm, something that I felt a lot more comfortable doing rather than a big surge on the KOM. We just dragged the effort out into a very long threshold type effort. Got to the top of the KOM, managed to hold off the little group behind, and then on the descent, the rider with me absolutely did one on me and dropped me just before we got to the bottom. Now, I couldn't close the gap, so sensibly I decided to just put my head down and time trial to the finish. Thankfully, I just about held off the group, but I was caught on the line to finish a top 20. A respectable 18th, about 1 minute 23 seconds down on the winner. Now, the front group was roughly about 10 riders. There was another little group behind, but people were in 1s and 2s. So I was kind of in no man's land a little bit, but I was still happy with the top 20, averaging 298 watts with a normalised power of 334 watts. But the real sting was in those climbs. And my normalised power was really high, and I noted in the stream that that was as high as it's been in any Zwift Elite race, just by the nature of the course. Moving on, 24 hours later in fact, to the Cycling Time Trial Winter Racing Series. Now this is relatively new, and well, as you guessed by the title, it's a time trial. It's something I'm going to be doing, hopefully, on a weekly basis, every Wednesday night. They also have an event on a Saturday as well, I think. But this is something that I always enjoy doing. Long threshold type, steady state efforts, I love doing. And because they're going to be doing a variety of different courses, I'm really keen to not just do the flat ones, such as the one we did in this race, 19.5 kilometers on the Tempus route, but also they're going to be doing some undulating, hilly, possibly what you would class as mountain time trials further on in the next couple of months. Now, because this is like my bread and butter effort, I love doing time trials, it's kind of boring to do a summary of, because I had a rough estimate of what sort of power I'd want to hold, and I basically set off just below that. Now, a 26-minute effort, for me anyway, is still a long time to be hovering around that red line. And I always stress the importance of trying a negative split 99.9% of the time. If it's a pan flat course, obviously there's no wind on Zwift, but you kind of want to give yourself that breathing space, that margin of error in case something happens, in case you're not on a good day, in case you've overestimated your abilities, which happens quite a lot, even to me, and just gives you some scope to at least finish strong. I think mentally, that's a big part. So my graph looked very funky at the end of this. It was a classic negative split, setting off at around 340 watts. You could see in the top left of the screen that the average power was being tracked, and it was just gradually going up throughout the time trial. And probably around halfway, time-wise, about 13 minutes in, was when it started to just bite a little bit. But that's because the effort, you know, the physiological changes that are occurring are coming to meet, I guess, the RPE, like what it should really feel like. And why a negative split is important in this scenario is because you don't want to overextend yourself early on. Just because it feels easy, you always have to keep in mind that the effort is probably going to catch up with you later down the line, even if you set off easy versus setting off hard. So that's why it's always a little bit safer to set off slightly below what you think you can do. And even if you finish much stronger than you expect, you've gathered some information for next time. So that's what I did. I finished really strong. And although I really did suffer the last 5-10 minutes, I was still in control. So getting to the finish, seeing my average power was 357 watts for 26 minutes. It means that going into this week's time trial, I can gauge for a 30 to 35 minute effort. I just might need to think about averaging slightly less than that. But of course, with climbs involved and undulating terrain, it makes it a little bit more spicy. So in the next video that we do, maybe next week, of my racing recaps from the week, I'll talk about how I ended up pacing that undulating time trial. So I finished 6th, which is a great ride, and I did think I wouldn't be competitive with people who are pushing over 400 watts or close to 400 watts because of the raw power on a flat course. So again, I'm interested to see what happens on the hillier courses. Alright, so that takes us into the last race live stream of the week, and that was at the Virtuslow 4 Endurance League Stage 2 in London. The London Loop Reverse, in fact. It was going to be 2 laps and 42 kilometers. So we did Fox Hill, I think, twice. So you do the descent of Box Hill, which is obviously quite a shallow descent. Now, I finished third in this race, and according to the comments, the live chat on the stream at the time, people were going nuts a little bit because we had one rider in the race who was potentially on equipment that was maybe overestimating power ever so slightly. But not just that, I was intent on making the race not finish in a reduced bunch sprint, or any kind of sprint for that matter. And so I was throwing everything at the group in the last like 10 kilometers. The highlights of this route are, of course, Fox Hill. You do that climb twice, but then you have a significant amount of flat road through the London streets to the finish. And so I had to really think about making the race quite hard, quite aggressive, quite, not giving anybody much time to rest or catch their breath in that last 10 kilometers. The difference wasn't being made on the climb because the climb wasn't hard enough, really, and it was also a long way to the finish from the top of the climb. So I decided to throw attack after attack after attack going into that last 10 kilometers. And it was a lot of fun because when you feel good, you don't have to be really fit, you don't have to feel fit, you don't have to be in form. But sometimes when you're on one of those days where you feel like you can really dig deep, I felt like I was on one of those days. The last 10 kilometers were quite exciting. They were quite painful, but I think they were quite exciting. And although it didn't unfold the way I wanted it to, in a way where I wanted to get some separation and possibly go solo, because the group was getting quite small, I didn't get away, and instead ended up coming to the finish with about 5 or 6 riders, up to the last kilometer, looking directly down the barrel of having to sprint it out. Now, it was a very long, drawn-out sprint. This was helped by one rider, Sorensen, who attacked early, and in doing so, dragged us into a much longer sprint than I think maybe we wanted. Nico, the rider that eventually won, played it very cool, made me launch my sprint early with about 900 meters to go. I had to react almost to Sorensen, who eventually finished second, who I got across to him, went over the top of him, but then Nico just came past me on the descent to the line. Very strange sprint because you have the uphill, then you have the downhill. Very difficult, like for someone who hasn't got big raw watts to be competitive on something like that. But I had no choice but to go along anyway, and Christian Sorensen just made the effort much longer anyway. So it was a very tough finish. I was on my last legs, and in fact my legs just seized with about 200-300 meters to go. But it was an awesome race. I really enjoyed it. And again, the numbers don't lie. This race was the same length, like 57 minutes, 58 minutes, as the Zwift Racing League on Tuesday. But normalized power was 343 watts. So I did more normalized power for the same duration. But obviously the distribution of that is different to that race on Tuesday night. That was a much more specific, 4 times 3 minute KOM effort, if you will. Whereas this race was, I guess, just much more of a slogfest, and power was that much higher towards the end because there was lots of short, sharp, attacking effort. So there we go. That's a wrap up of last week's live streams and Zwift races. There's going to be way more this week as well, potentially 4. We have the Zwift Racing League on Tuesdays, we have the time trials on Wednesdays, we have the new Prestige League happening on Thursday. It's not every Thursday, I don't think, but it will be this Thursday, and then Sunday again, the Virtue Slow race that we did on Sunday. It'll be race number 3, I think. So, lots to come, so make sure you're subscribed and like if you enjoy these type of videos.